Chapter 1. The silent partner. Brian Keller liked the hum of machines. It was predictable, steady, unlike people who always seemed to need something from him. Down in the lower levels of the building, near the server room, the air was cool and dry, and the fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over rows of humming racks. This was his sanctuary. No glass walls, no panoramic city views, no boardroom theatrics. Just code, cables, and the occasional assistant knocking on his door with a trouble ticket. At 31, Brian had perfected the art of invisibility. Officially, he was a senior technical advisor. Unofficially, he was the backbone of the company, a fact known only to one other person. The CEO, his former professor at MIT and now his closest friend. Together, they had built this empire from scratch. 2 years ago, their startup went public, and the world applauded the charismatic CEO who dazzled investors with vision and charm. Brian preferred to stay in the shadows, writing the code that powered everything. It wasn't that Brian disliked people. He just didn't know what to do with them. Small talk felt like debugging a program without documentation, awkward and full of errors. He had tried dating apps once, but the experience was like a poorly designed UI. Too many buttons, none of them intuitive. So he stuck to what he knew: algorithms, clean syntax, and coffee strong enough to power a rocket. His office reflected his personality: minimalist, functional, and slightly eccentric. A whiteboard covered in equations dominated one wall. A shelf held a mix of programming books and odd trinkets. A Rubik's Cube, a tiny plush penguin, and a coffee mug that read, "There's no place like 127001. His assistants called him the Basement Wizard, a nickname he pretended to hate but secretly found amusing. Today was supposed to be routine. A few system checks, a couple of bug fixes, and maybe a quiet lunch at his desk. But at 2:15 p.m., his phone buzzed with a message from the CEO. "Coffee? My office. Now." Brian frowned. The CEO rarely summoned him during the day unless something was wrong. He grabbed his notebook, old habits die hard, and took the elevator up to the top floor. The contrast was jarring. Polished marble floors, glass partitions, and a view of the city skyline that screamed success. Brian always felt like an imposter up here, like someone had accidentally let the sysadmin into a luxury hotel. The CEO's office was spacious, warm, and smelled faintly of expensive leather. His mentor, Dr. Alan Whitmore, though everyone called him Alan now, was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the city like a man searching for answers in the skyline. "Brian," Alan said, turning with a tired smile. "Thanks for coming." Brian nodded and took a seat across from the mahogany desk. "What's up?" "Systems stable. No fires." Alan chuckled, but it lacked its usual spark. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the sleek machine on the credenza and handed one to Brian. "It's not about the system. It's personal." Brian raised an eyebrow. Alan was many things: brilliant, charismatic, occasionally dramatic, but rarely personal in the office. "Okay," Brian said slowly. "Shoot." Alan sat down, cradling his cup like it held the weight of his thoughts. "I want my son to join the company." Brian blinked. "Your son? The one who, plays golf and posts motivational quotes on Instagram?" Alan supplied dryly. "Yes, that one." Brian suppressed a smile. He had met Ethan Whitmore a few times at company events. Polished, charming, and radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about rent. They had never spoken beyond polite nods. Alan continued, his voice heavy. "He needs experience. Real experience. I thought bringing him in might help." Brian shrugged. "Your call. You know I trust your judgment." Alan hesitated, then leaned back in his chair, looking suddenly older. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, in a voice stripped of its usual bravado, he said, "Brian, I'm going to be completely honest with you. You deserve nothing but the truth." Brian set his cup down, sensing the shift. "Okay." Alan stared at the dark liquid in his mug like it might offer answers. "I'm worried about my son. He's changed since the money came in. My wife too. I thought success would make life better, but now, I barely recognize them." Brian stayed quiet. He had learned long ago that silence was often the best response. Alan's laugh was short and bitter. "My wife has a standing brunch with her friends that I pay for, but I'm not invited. Ethan's 27, living entirely on my dime. If I try to set boundaries, my wife threatens divorce." He paused, then looked at Brian with a clarity that cut through the fatigue. "I think she's going to leave me." Brian felt a jolt of alarm. "Alan." Alan held up a hand. "Not today. Not tomorrow. But soon. She's enjoying her new life too much to disrupt it. It's only a matter of time before one of her friends helps her do the math. How she could keep the money and lose me." Brian searched for words, but all he found was honesty. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" Alan smiled faintly. "That's why you're a great partner. You didn't try to fix it or pity me. You asked about me." He studied Brian for a long moment, then nodded to himself, as if making a decision. "Come here." Brian followed him to the office safe, confusion mounting. Alan unlocked it, pulled out a thick folder, and returned to the desk. Inside were documents Brian recognized instantly: Ownership papers, stock certificates, legal agreements. Alan's voice was steady now. With the way my life looks like it's headed, I can't put the company at risk. I'm signing over half my shares to you. That gives you 75% ownership. Brian stared at him, stunned. Alan, what? Why? Because I trust you, Alan said simply. You won't abuse it. You'll protect what we built. Brian opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. I don't even know what to say. Say yes, Alan replied almost gently. For the company. For the people who depend on us. Brian nodded slowly, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He didn't want power. He wanted stability. But if this was the failsafe to protect everything they had built, he would take it. They met later with legal counsel, signed the papers, and filed them quietly. No announcements. No fanfare. As far as the world was concerned, nothing had changed. Alan was still the CEO. Brian was still the guy in the basement. And that was exactly how Brian wanted it. For now. Chapter 2. Coffee and confessions. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual, though Brian knew it was just his thoughts stretching time. He returned to his office, sat at his desk, and stared at the blank monitor for a full minute before realizing he hadn't even powered it on. Ownership. 75%. The number echoed in his head like a system alert he couldn't dismiss. He didn't want this. Not the power, not the title, not the weight of knowing that if things went wrong, it would all land on him. He had built systems to be resilient, fault-tolerant, self-healing. People weren't like that. People crashed hard. Brian rubbed his temples and tried to focus on something familiar, code. He opened his IDE, stared at the lines of logic, and felt a flicker of calm. Code didn't lie. It didn't betray. It didn't ask for brunch money or threaten divorce. It just worked if you treated it right. His phone buzzed again. Alan, still in your office? Brian typed back, yeah, come back up. One more thing. Brian sighed, saved his work, and made the trek upstairs again. When he entered Alan's office, the CEO was sitting behind his desk, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in an hour. The coffee cups were still there, cold and forgotten. Brian, Alan said, gesturing to the chair. Sit. Brian sat. You okay? Alan gave a humorless laugh. Define okay. Brian didn't answer. He just waited. Alan leaned forward, elbows on the desk, fingers steepled. I need you to promise me something. Brian frowned. What kind of promise? That you'll keep this quiet, Alan said. About the shares. About everything. Brian nodded. Of course. Alan exhaled, relieved. Good. Because if my wife finds out, she'll see dollar signs. And Ethan. He trailed off, shaking his head. He thinks this company is his birthright. Brian's lips twitched. That's optimistic. Alan chuckled softly. You have no idea. He sobered quickly. He's starting next month. I'll put him in operations. Keep him busy. Brian raised an eyebrow. Operations? Does he know what a workflow is? Alan smirked. He knows what a golf swing is. Brian groaned inwardly. Great. Alan's expression softened. Brian, I know this isn't what you signed up for. You wanted to write code, not play corporate chess. Brian shrugged. I'll manage. Alan studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, You're a better man than I am. Brian didn't know what to do with that, so he just nodded and stood. I'll keep things running. As he left the office, Brian felt the weight settle deeper. He wasn't just a silent partner anymore. He was the failsafe, the firewall, the last line of defense against chaos. The next few weeks passed in a blur of code reviews, system audits, and quiet dread. Ethan Whitmore arrived like a storm in designer shoes, charming, confident, and utterly convinced he was the smartest person in the room. Brian watched from the sidelines, amused and mildly horrified, as Ethan shook hands, cracked jokes, and started optimizing workflows he barely understood. First, it was harmless. A few tweaks here, a suggestion there. But soon, Brian's daily system briefs began to show anomalies, bottlenecks, delays, processes rerouted through inefficient paths. He flagged them politely, sent reports to the managers, and assumed reason would prevail. Didn't. Ethan took the reports as a personal affront. Instead of fixing the issues, he doubled down, making changes without consulting anyone. Brian tried to talk to him, calmly, logically, like debugging a stubborn piece of code, but Ethan heard criticism, not collaboration. The tension simmered, quiet but palpable. Assistants whispered in hallways. Interns speculated about the basement guy and the boss's son. Brian ignored the noise and focused on the system, patching what he could, documenting what he couldn't, until the day Ethan snapped. It happened on a Thursday, late afternoon. Brian was in his office, reviewing a critical update, when the door swung open without warning. Ethan stood there, jaw tight, eyes blazing. Brian, he said, voice sharp. Got a minute? Brian swiveled his chair slowly. Sure. Ethan strode in, slammed a folder on the desk. What is this? Brian glanced at the folder. It was his latest system brief. Status report. Ethan's laugh was harsh. Status report? Looks more like a hit piece. Brian blinked. Excuse me? You think you're clever, don't you? Ethan snapped. Undermining me with these passive-aggressive notes. Brian kept his tone even. They're not notes. They're data. Data? Ethan sneered. You know what I see? A guy who's been wasting this company's money for years. Brian stared at him, calm as ever. Ethan, I'm just doing my job. Not anymore, Ethan said coldly. You're fired. The words hung in the air like a system crash. Brian felt nothing. No anger, no panic. Just a quiet click in his mind, like a switch flipping. Okay, he said. Ethan blinked, thrown off by the lack of protest. Okay. Brian stood, grabbed his jacket. I'll clean out my desk. Ethan smirked. Security will escort you. Brian nodded. Of course. As he walked out, flanked by two nervous guards, Brian felt a strange calm settle over him. Ethan thought he had won. He had no idea what game he was playing. And Brian was about to rewrite the rules. Chapter 3. Enter the Prince. Ethan Whitmore strutted through the office like he owned the place, which in his mind he practically did. Designer suit, perfect hair, and that smug grin that made assistants roll their eyes the second he passed. Brian had seen it all before, but now, watching from the sidelines as security escorted him out, he felt oddly detached. Like he was debugging a system he'd already decided to wipe clean. The elevator doors closed behind him with a soft chime. Brian didn't look back. He didn't need to. Ethan thought he had won. He thought firing the basement guy was a power move. Brian almost smiled. If Ethan were code, Brian would label him malware, flashy, invasive, and destined for quarantine. Downstairs, the hum of servers greeted him like an old friend. He packed lightly, just his notebook, his favorite mug, and the tiny plush penguin that had sat on his desk since grad school. The assistants hovered awkwardly, torn between loyalty and fear. You okay, Brian? One of them asked, voice tentative. Brian nodded. Never better. It wasn't a lie. He felt calm, calculated, like a chess player 3 moves ahead. The next morning, Brian walked into the boardroom like he belonged there, because technically he did. The long mahogany table gleamed under recessed lights. Suits lined the chairs, murmuring in confusion. At the head sat Alan, looking pale and defeated. Ethan lounged near the corner, scrolling on his phone like this was a victory lap. Brian took the seat at the head of the table. Conversations died instantly. Alan looked up, eyes flickering with something between relief and dread. Ethan frowned, clearly annoyed that the basement guy had wandered into his kingdom. Brian placed a folder on the table, his voice calm, almost casual. We have a problem. Ethan smirked. Yeah, we do. You're trespassing. Brian ignored him. I was terminated yesterday without cause by someone without the authority to terminate me. He opened the folder, revealing the signed agreements. Per the partnership contract, that activates the bad faith clause. The room went still. Brian continued, his tone steady. Effective immediately, all shares revert to my sole control. 100%. Ethan's phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the table. What? Alan closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing for impact. Brian looked at Ethan, expression unreadable. You didn't just fire an employee. You tried to cut out a partner. The silence was deafening. Then, slowly, the realization rippled through the room. Brian wasn't just the guy in the basement. He was the majority owner. The firewall. The root password no one knew existed. Ethan sputtered, grasping for excuses. You can't. I can, Brian said simply. And I have. Security escorted Ethan out minutes later, his protests echoing down the hall. Brian barely heard them. He was already thinking ahead, about stabilizing operations, reassuring investors, and finding someone competent to lead the company. Someone who wasn't him. Brian hated the spotlight. He hated the way people looked at him now, like he had been hiding a crown under his hoodie. He didn't want to be king. He wanted to be left alone with his code. But for now, he was interim CEO, and that meant meetings, presentations, and God help him, networking, which is how he met Sophie. It was a Tuesday, 2 weeks after the boardroom bombshell. Brian was in the design wing, reviewing a new interface proposal. He didn't usually handle UI work, but the team insisted he weigh in. He stood awkwardly near a whiteboard covered in colorful sketches, feeling like a penguin at a fashion show. Brian Keller? A voice said behind him, warm, confident, with a hint of amusement. He turned and froze. She was striking, but not in the glossy magazine way Ethan's crowd favored. Sophie had an easy elegance. Dark curls pulled into a messy bun, glasses perched on her nose, and a smile that looked like it belonged in a place where people laughed freely. She wore jeans and a blazer, sleeves rolled up, like she was ready to wrestle ideas into submission. Yes, Brian said, a beat too late. She extended a hand. Sophie Lang, UX lead. Brian shook her hand, trying not to notice how firm her grip was. Nice to meet you. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity. So you're the guy who lives in the basement. Brian blinked. That's one way to put it. She grinned. Relax. It's a compliment. Anyone who prefers servers to boardrooms is my kind of person. Brian felt something unfamiliar. A flicker of warmth, like a system booting after a long shutdown. I guess that's accurate. Sophie tilted her head, studying him. You don't look like the type who fires people. Brian's lips twitched. I didn't fire anyone. Rumor mill says otherwise, she teased. Brian sighed. Rumor mill needs better data. She laughed. A bright, unguarded sound that made Brian's chest tighten unexpectedly. Fair enough. So, Mr. Firewall, what do you think of our new interface? Brian glanced at the sketches, then back at her. It's colorful. Sophie raised an eyebrow. That's your professional opinion? Brian hesitated, then said honestly, I'm a back-end guy. My idea of design is making sure the error logs don't look like a horror novel. She laughed again and Brian found himself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in weeks. Tell you what, Sophie said, grabbing a marker. You give me your brutally honest feedback, and I'll teach you what a color palette is. Brian considered her, the marker twirling between her fingers like a challenge. For once, he didn't feel like running back to the basement. Deal, he said. As Sophie sketched and explained, Brian listened. Not just to her words, but to the cadence of her voice, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about user flow. She was sharp, funny, and utterly unpretentious. And for reasons he couldn't quite debug, Brian felt something shift inside him. Maybe, just maybe, life wasn't all code and contracts. Maybe there was room for color. Chapter 4, Workflow Wars. Brian had never seen so many charts in his life. Pie charts, bar graphs, flow diagrams, an entire buffet of corporate visuals sprawled across the conference table like a crime scene. He stared at them, expression blank, while the operations manager explained how Ethan's optimizations had turned the company's workflow into a spaghetti bowl of inefficiency. See here, the manager said, tapping a chart with a pen. He rerouted approvals through 3 extra layers. It's like he thought bureaucracy was a performance feature. Brian pinched the bridge of his nose. How long to fix it? The manager hesitated. Weeks, maybe months. Brian sighed. Start today. The manager nodded and scurried off, leaving Brian alone with the mess. He hated this part, the politics, the cleanup, the endless meetings. He wanted to be back in his basement, debugging code, not debugging egos. He gathered the charts, shoved them into a folder, and headed toward the design wing. He didn't need to be there, technically, but he found himself drifting that way more often lately. Maybe because Sophie was there. Maybe because talking to her felt easy in a way nothing else did. Sophie was perched on a stool, sketching on a tablet, her curls escaping the bun like rebellious code snippets. She looked up as Brian entered, her smile quick and warm. Mr. Firewall, she said. Back for another crash course in color theory? Brian smirked. I'll stick to grayscale. She laughed, setting the tablet aside. You look like you just wrestled a database. Close, Brian said, dropping the folder on the table. Workflow disaster. Courtesy of Ethan. Sophie raised an eyebrow. The prince strikes again? Brian chuckled softly. More like a rogue script. Pretty, but catastrophic. She grinned. You talk about people like their code. Brian shrugged. It's easier that way. Sophie tilted her head, studying him. You know, for someone who hates drama, you've had a front row seat lately. Brian sighed. I didn't buy the ticket. Life doesn't ask, she said lightly. It just drags you into the theater. Brian smiled despite himself. True. She hopped off the stool, walked over, and peeked at the charts. Wow, that's colorful. Brian groaned. Don't start. She laughed, then glanced at him, her tone softening. You okay? Brian hesitated. He wasn't used to that question. Not in the office, not without an agenda. I'm managing. Sophie nodded like she understood more than he said. Well, if you need a break, I know a coffee shop that serves something called a debug latte. Brian blinked. That's oddly specific. She smiled. It's just a latte with extra espresso. But the name made me think of you. Brian felt a flicker of warmth, unexpected and disarming. Maybe I'll take you up on that. Maybe, she teased. That's not very decisive for a CEO. Brian grimaced. Temporary CEO. Still counts, she said, eyes dancing. Come on, Brian. Live a little. He opened his mouth to reply, but his phone buzzed. A meeting reminder. He glanced at the screen and sighed. Board call. Rain check. Sophie smiled. Rain check. As he walked away, Brian realized something strange. For the first time in weeks, he was looking forward to something that wasn't work. The board call was brutal. Investors wanted reassurance, managers wanted clarity, and Brian wanted to crawl under his desk. He gave them what they needed: calm, logical answers, a roadmap for fixing Ethan's mess. But the moment the call ended, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He thought about Sophie's smile, her laugh, the way she said live a little like it was the simplest thing in the world. Maybe he could. Chapter 5. The firing fallout. By Friday morning, the story had leaked. Brian didn't know how. Maybe a disgruntled assistant, maybe Ethan himself, but the headlines were everywhere. Silent partner steps into spotlight. Tech firm shakeup after CEO's son fired. Basement genius or boardroom shark? Meet Brian Keller. Brian stared at his phone, grimacing. He hated attention. He hated the word genius even more. It made him sound like a circus act. He tossed the phone onto his desk and muttered, "Great, just great." The knock on his door came seconds later. Sophie leaned in, holding 2 coffee cups and wearing a grin that could power a small city. "Congratulations," she said, stepping inside. "You're famous." Brian groaned. "Kill me now." She laughed, setting a cup in front of him. "Double shot. You'll need it." Brian eyed her warily. "How bad is it?" "Depends," she said, perching on the edge of his desk. "If you like being called the mystery mogul, you're having a great day." Brian buried his face in his hands. "I'm going to uninstall the internet." Sophie chuckled, sipping her coffee. "Relax. It's just noise. People love a good underdog story." "I'm not an underdog," Brian muttered. "I'm a guy who wanted to write code and got dragged into a soap opera." "Same difference," she said lightly. "You're trending." Brian peeked at her through his fingers. "You're enjoying this?" "Absolutely," she said without shame. "Watching you squirm is the highlight of my week." Brian sighed, but a reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "You're cruel." "Honest," she corrected. "And speaking of honesty, you need air." Brian frowned. "Air?" "Yes," Sophie said, hopping off the desk. "Fresh air. Away from servers and scandal. Come on." Brian blinked. "Where?" "Coffee shop," she said, grabbing his jacket before he could protest. "Debug latte. Remember?" Brian hesitated, then stood. "Fine. But if anyone recognizes me..." "They won't," she said, grinning. "You're wearing a hoodie. You look like every other tech guy in the city." The coffee shop was tucked into a quiet corner of downtown, all exposed brick and Edison bulbs. Sophie led the way to a small table by the window, her energy like sunlight breaking through Brian's perpetual cloud cover. He sat, feeling oddly out of place among the chatter and clinking cups. Sophie ordered for both of them 2 debug lattes, extra shot, and slid into the seat across from him. "So," she said, chin resting on her hand, "how does it feel to be the most mysterious man in tech?" Brian grimaced. "Like a bug in production." She laughed, bright and unguarded. "You're terrible at metaphors." "Occupational hazard," he said dryly. Their drinks arrived, steaming and fragrant. Brian took a cautious sip and blinked. "This is good." "Told you," Sophie said, smiling. "See? Living a little isn't fatal." Brian studied her for a moment. The way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the way she seemed completely at ease in a world that felt like chaos to him. He felt something shift, subtle but undeniable, like a line of code executing after years of being commented out. "You're good at this," he said quietly. Sophie tilted her head. "At what?" "Making things less complicated." She smiled, softer now. "Maybe you just needed someone to remind you that life isn't all error logs." Brian chuckled, and for the first time in weeks, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Outside, the city buzzed with headlines and speculation. Inside, Brian sat across from Sophie, sipping coffee and wondering if maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something worth debugging. Chapter 6. The boardroom bombshell. Brian had survived the headlines. Barely. The board had demanded a press statement. Investors wanted reassurance, and the PR team had thrown around words like strategic narrative and brand positioning until Brian considered faking a server outage just to escape. Instead, he sat in the glass-walled conference room, nursing his 3rd coffee and wondering if anyone would notice if he crawled under the table. "Smile," Sophie whispered from the seat beside him, her voice warm and teasing. "You look like you're plotting world domination." Brian muttered. "I'm plotting my escape." She grinned. "You'd need a better poker face." Brian shot her a look. "You're enjoying this?" "Immensely," she said, eyes sparkling. "Watching you pretend to be a corporate shark is my new favorite hobby." Brian sighed. "I'm not a shark." "No," Sophie said thoughtfully. "You're more like a very determined penguin." Brian blinked. "A penguin? Smart, loyal, slightly awkward on land," she said, lips twitching. "But deadly in the water." Brian stared at her, then deadpanned. "That's oddly flattering." She laughed, and the sound cut through the tension like sunlight through fog. "Relax, Mr. Firewall. You're doing fine." Brian leaned closer, lowering his voice. "If I survive this meeting, I'm buying you dinner." Sophie raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Is that a bribe?" "A thank you," Brian said, his tone dry but his eyes warm. "For keeping me from short-circuiting." She tilted her head, pretending to consider. "Depends. Are we talking actual dinner or your idea of dinner? Which I'm guessing involves instant ramen and a server log." Brian smirked. "Actual dinner, with real food, and maybe wine." Her smile widened, slow and deliberate. "Careful, Keller." That almost sounded like flirting. Brian held her gaze, pulse ticking faster than he liked. Maybe it was. For a moment, the noise of the boardroom faded. The charts, the jargon, the endless talk of shareholder confidence. It was just Sophie, her eyes bright with mischief, and Brian, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, anticipation. Then the chairman cleared his throat, and reality crashed back in. "Mr. Keller," he said, voice booming. "Your thoughts on the proposed restructuring?" Brian blinked, sat up straight, and answered with calm precision, because if there was one thing he could do under pressure, it was execute. But as he spoke, he felt Sophie's gaze linger, warm and steady, like a promise waiting just beyond the firewall. Chapter 7. Debugging life. The office was quiet after hours, eerily so. The hum of servers downstairs was a distant lullaby, and the city lights outside painted streaks of gold across the glass walls. Brian sat alone in the design wing, staring at a half-empty coffee cup and wondering why he hadn't gone home yet. Truth was, he didn't want to. Not tonight. He was scrolling through workflow reports when a voice broke the silence. "Still here." Sophie leaned against the doorway, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the hallway lights. She held a paper bag in one hand and wore that smile, the one that made Brian feel like the world wasn't entirely broken. Brian looked up, startled but secretly pleased. "You too," she shrugged, stepping inside. "Deadlines don't care about dinner plans." She lifted the bag. "Speaking of dinner, I brought reinforcements." Brian blinked. "Reinforcements?" "Thai takeout," she said, setting the bag on the table. "Because I had a feeling you'd be living on caffeine and existential dread." Brian chuckled, the sound low and genuine. "You're not wrong." She grinned, pulling out containers. "Pad Thai for you. Extra peanuts. Don't ask how I know." Brian raised an eyebrow. "You've been profiling me?" "UX designers notice patterns," she said, handing him chopsticks. "You're a creature of habit, Keller." Brian smirked. "And what pattern did you notice?" "That I'm boring." "Consistent," she corrected, eyes twinkling. "There's a difference." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "You're dangerous. Only to bad interfaces," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "And maybe to guys who think grayscale is a personality trait." Brian grinned, picking up his chopsticks. "Ouch." She winked. "You'll survive." They ate in companionable silence for a moment, the quiet punctuated by the distant hum of the city. Then Sophie spoke, her tone lighter but edged with curiosity. "So, Mr. Firewall," she said, twirling noodles. "What's it like being the guy everyone suddenly wants a piece of?" Brian grimaced. "Like being a server under a DDoS attack." She laughed, bright and unguarded. "You really can't turn off the tech metaphors, can you?" "Occupational hazard," he said dryly. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "Seriously, though, you've handled all this insanely well." Brian shrugged. "I'm good at systems. People, not so much." "People aren't that different," she said softly. "They just need clear inputs." Brian met her gaze, something warm flickering in his chest. "And what's your input?" Her smile was slow, deliberate. "Live a little." Brian chuckled, shaking his head. "You keep saying that. Because you keep ignoring it," she teased. "You're running life in safe mode." Brian smirked. "And you're suggesting what? Full reboot?" "Maybe," she said, eyes dancing. "Maybe just a patch update." Brian laughed, and for the first time in weeks it didn't feel forced. Felt easy, natural, like something he could get used to. They lingered long after the food was gone, talking about everything and nothing. Movies, music, the absurdity of corporate jargon. Sophie teased him about his hoodie collection. Brian countered with a deadpan critique of her obsession with color palettes. It was light, effortless, and when she finally stood to leave, Brian felt an unexpected pang. "Thanks for dinner," he said quietly. She smiled, warm and steady. "Anytime." As she walked away, Brian realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about code or contracts. He was thinking about her. And that scared him in the best possible way. Chapter 8. Coffee with Sophie. Brian wasn't sure how it happened. One minute he was reviewing system logs. The next he was sitting across from Sophie in a quiet cafe that smelled like roasted beans and warm vanilla. It wasn't planned, at least not by him. Sophie had texted, "Coffee? You owe me for pad thai." And somehow, against all his instincts to avoid unnecessary human interaction, he said yes. Now here he was, nursing a cappuccino and wondering why his pulse felt like a jittery script running in an infinite loop. Sophie stirred her drink with casual grace, her curls catching the soft light. "You look tense," she said, eyes dancing. "Relax. No board members here. Just caffeine and judgment-free conversation." Brian smirked. "Judgment-free? You've called me a penguin twice." "3 times," she corrected, grinning. "And it was affectionate." Brian shook his head, amused despite himself. "You have an odd definition of affection." "Better than yours," she teased. "You thanked me for dinner like you were submitting a bug report." Brian chuckled, the sound low and warm. "I'm not great at social scripts." "I noticed," she said, leaning in slightly. "But you're honest. That's rare." Brian looked at her, something tightening in his chest. "Honesty's easier than pretending." Sophie tilted her head, studying him. So what's the honest version of Brian Keller? Not the headlines, not the boardroom, just you. Brian hesitated. Vulnerability wasn't his default setting. He preferred firewalls, literal and metaphorical. But something about Sophie's gaze made him want to open a port. Just a little. I like quiet, he said finally. I like things that make sense. Code makes sense. People don't. Sophie smiled softly. People are messy, but sometimes messy is good. Brian gave a dry laugh. Tell that to my error logs. She laughed too, then sobered. Seriously, though, you've been through a lot. Overnight fame, corporate drama, and you're still standing. Brian shrugged. Standing doesn't mean steady. Her eyes softened. What would make you steady? Brian met her gaze, pulse ticking faster. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe this. Sophie blinked. This? Coffee, he said quickly, then added quieter. And you. For a moment, silence stretched between them, warm, charged, like static before a spark. Then Sophie smiled, slow and genuine. Careful, Keller, she said, voice teasing but gentle. That almost sounded like flirting. Brian held her gaze, his lips curving. Maybe it was. She laughed, bright and unguarded, and Brian felt something shift inside him, like a system reboot after years of running in safe mode. They lingered long after the cups were empty, talking about everything from bad UI horror stories to favorite books. Sophie teased him about his hoodie collection. Brian countered with a deadpan critique of her obsession with color palettes. It was easy, effortless, and when they finally stepped out into the cool night air, Brian realized he didn't want the evening to end. Walk you home? He asked, surprising himself. Sophie smiled, eyes warm. Sure. And just like that, Brian Keller, silent partner, reluctant CEO, master of firewalls, found himself walking through the city beside someone who made the world feel a little less complicated. Chapter 9. Exits and entrances. The headlines were merciless. CEO's son fired in corporate coup. Inside the tech power shift. From basement to boardroom, Brian Keller's silent takeover. Brian scrolled through the articles with a grimace, each headline louder than the last. He hated this. The attention, the speculation, the endless parade of talking heads dissecting his life like it was an open source project. He wanted to crawl back to his server room and vanish into the hum of machines. Instead, he was in his office, fielding calls from investors who sounded more panicked than rational. The PR team had drafted 3 different statements, all dripping with corporate jargon Brian couldn't stomach. Strategic realignment, leadership continuity, visionary stewardship. It all sounded like a bad marketing pitch. His phone buzzed again. Sophie. Surviving the apocalypse? Brian smirked and typed back, barely. Meet me in the lobby. You need air. Brian stared at the message for a moment, then pushed back his chair. Air sounded good. Air and Sophie sounded even better. She was waiting by the glass doors, casual in jeans and a leather jacket, her curls loose around her shoulders. When she saw him, her smile was quick and warm, the kind that made the chaos fade for a moment. You look like you've been through a denial of service attack, she said, eyes twinkling. Brian chuckled. Feels accurate. Come on, she said, grabbing his sleeve. You're officially off duty. Brian raised an eyebrow. Is that allowed? Consider it a UX intervention, she said, leading him outside. You're running life in safe mode again. Brian smirked. You really like that metaphor. It fits, she said, grinning. And tonight we're installing updates. The restaurant was small, tucked into a quiet street, all warm lighting and soft jazz. Sophie had picked it, of course she had. Brian would never have found it on his own. He wasn't a find cute places guy. He was a grab coffee and code until midnight guy. They slid into a corner booth, menus forgotten as Sophie leaned in, her chin resting on her hand. So, Mr. Firewall, she said, voice teasing. How does it feel to be the most mysterious man in tech? Brian groaned. Like a bug in production. She laughed, bright and unguarded. You really can't turn off the metaphors, can you? Occupational hazard, he said dryly. Her smile softened. Seriously, though, you've handled all this insanely well. Brian shrugged. I'm good at systems. People, not so much. People aren't that different, she said softly. They just need clear inputs. Brian met her gaze, something warm flickering in his chest. And what's your input? Her smile was slow, deliberate. Live a little. Brian chuckled, shaking his head. You keep saying that. Because you keep ignoring it, she teased. You're running life in safe mode. Brian smirked. And you're suggesting what? Full reboot. Maybe, she said, eyes dancing. Maybe just a patch update. Brian laughed, and for the first time in weeks it didn't feel forced. Felt easy, natural, like something he could get used to. They lingered long after the food was gone, talking about everything and nothing. Movies, music, the absurdity of corporate jargon. Sophie teased him about his hoodie collection. Brian countered with a deadpan critique of her obsession with color palettes. It was light, effortless, and when she finally stood to leave, Brian felt an unexpected pang. Thanks for dinner, he said quietly. She smiled, warm and steady. Anytime. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Brian realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about code or contracts. He was thinking about her. And that scared him in the best possible way. Chapter 10. The big reveal. The boardroom was silent, the kind of silence that hums louder than noise. Brian stood at the head of the table, a folder in his hand, his expression calm but resolute. Alan sat beside him, shoulders tense, eyes shadowed with the weight of months of loss. The man who had once commanded rooms with effortless charm now looked like someone bracing for impact. Brian opened the folder, revealing the signed documents. Effective immediately, he said, his voice steady. Alan Whitmore is reinstated as CEO. Gasps rippled around the table. Alan's head snapped toward him, disbelief etched across his face. Brian, what? Brian met his gaze, something warm flickering beneath the calm. This was never about power. It was about protecting what we built. Alan's throat worked, words failing him. You didn't have to. I did, Brian said quietly. Because you're my partner. Always were. For a moment, Alan just stared at him, eyes bright with something Brian hadn't seen in weeks. Hope. Then he reached out, gripping Brian's hand with a force that spoke louder than words. Thank you, he whispered. Brian nodded, the weight on his shoulders lifting like a system finally cleared of errors. The board erupted in applause, but Brian barely heard it. His gaze had drifted, past the suits, past the polished table, to the doorway. Sophie stood there, watching. Her eyes met his, and in that instant, Brian felt everything. The chaos, the headlines, the sleepless nights, fade into something simple, something clear. She had seen it all. The loyalty, the integrity, the quiet strength he never advertised. And the look on her face told him she understood. When the meeting ended, Brian found her in the hallway, leaning against the wall like she belonged there. She smiled, soft and steady. That was incredible. Brian shrugged, trying for casual and failing. Just doing what's right. Sophie stepped closer, her voice low. You didn't have to give that back. Brian met her gaze, his own voice quiet but firm. It was never mine to keep. She studied him for a long moment, then said softly, You're a good man, Brian Keller. He swallowed, pulse ticking faster. I don't know about that. I do, she said, and before he could overthink it, before he could retreat behind firewalls and logic, Brian reached for her hand. It was warm, steady, grounding. Sophie's breath hitched, her eyes widening just slightly, and then she smiled, a smile that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Dinner, Brian said, his voice rougher than he intended. No boardrooms, no headlines, just us. Her fingers curled around his, firm and sure. Finally, she whispered, her grin teasing but her eyes bright with something deeper. And just like that, the man who had spent years hiding in the hum of servers stepped into something far more unpredictable, and far more worth the risk. Chapter 11. Love in Beta. Brian had never been so aware of silence. Not the sterile hum of servers or the muted buzz of fluorescent lights, the kind of silence that feels alive, charged, like a system waiting for input. He stood in his apartment doorway, watching Sophie step inside, her curls catching the soft glow of the city lights filtering through the blinds. Nice place, she said, glancing around. Her tone was casual, but her smile carried that familiar spark, the one that made Brian feel like the world wasn't entirely broken. Brian shrugged, suddenly self-conscious about the minimalist space. It's functional. Sophie grinned. Of course it is. You probably have a flowchart for your furniture. Brian smirked. Only for optimal cable management. She laughed, bright and unguarded, and Brian felt something loosen inside him. A knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. He gestured toward the couch. Make yourself comfortable. I'll grab drinks. Wine? She asked, arching a brow. Brian hesitated. I have coffee. Sophie chuckled, shaking her head. You're hopeless. Consistent, he corrected, disappearing into the kitchen. When he returned with 2 mugs, Sophie was curled on the couch, legs tucked under her, looking perfectly at home. Brian handed her a cup and sat beside her, leaving just enough space to feel safe, and just close enough to feel the pull. For a moment, they sipped in silence. Then Sophie spoke, her voice softer now. You know, you surprised me today. Brian glanced at her. How? Giving Alan his shares back, she said, studying him. Most people wouldn't have done that. Brian shrugged, eyes on his coffee. It wasn't mine to keep. That's not the point, she said gently. You had power. You could have kept it. But you didn't. Brian met her gaze, something raw flickering beneath the calm. Power doesn't matter if you lose yourself. Sophie held his eyes, and for a moment, the air between them felt like static before a spark. Then she smiled, soft, genuine. You're a good man, Brian Keller. He swallowed, pulse ticking faster. I don't know about that. I do, she said, and the quiet stretched warm, charged, like a system waiting for a command. Brian set his mug down, his voice low. You keep telling me to live a little. Sophie's lips curved. And maybe, I'm ready. Her breath hitched, just slightly, and then she smiled, a smile that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Finally," she whispered, teasing but tender. Brian reached for her hand, fingers brushing hers like a cautious line of code testing for errors. She didn't pull away. Instead, she closed the gap, her hand warm and steady in his. "Beta test?" she murmured, eyes dancing. Brian's lips curved, his voice rougher than he intended. "No. Full release." Her laugh was soft, breathless, and then, finally, he kissed her. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was real, warm, grounding, like a system reboot after years of running in safe mode. And for Brian Keller, who had spent his life behind firewalls and logic, it felt like the most terrifying, exhilarating thing he'd ever done. They stayed like that for a long time, the city humming outside, the world shrinking to two people and the quiet certainty that something had changed. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie rested her forehead against his, her voice a whisper. "Looks like you passed the test." Brian smiled, his chest light for the first time in years. Best patch update ever. Chapter 12. Partnership 2.0. The boardroom looked different today. Not because of the polished table or the skyline view, but because the tension that had hung like static for months was finally gone. Alan sat at the head of the table again, shoulders squared, voice steady as he outlined the company's next quarter strategy. The man was back, not the weary figure Brian had seen weeks ago, but the leader who had once inspired him in a lecture hall at MIT. Brian sat beside him, not as interim CEO, not as the reluctant face of a corporate empire, but as what he had always wanted to be, the guy who kept the system running, the firewall, the failsafe, the partner. When the meeting ended, Alan turned to him, eyes bright with gratitude. "You didn't just save the company," he said quietly. "You saved me." Brian shook his head. "You built this. I just kept it from crashing." Alan smiled, the kind of smile that carried years of trust. "Still, I owe you." Brian's lips curved. "You took a chance on a kid with too many dreams and not enough common sense. Alan, you're my partner. I didn't restore the original partnership because I felt guilty. I restored it because it's where you belong." Alan chuckled, a new spark in his eyes Brian hadn't seen in a long time, clapping him on the shoulder before heading out to greet the board members. Brian watched him go, feeling something he hadn't felt in months, peace. And then a familiar voice broke the moment. "Mr. Firewall," Sophie said, appearing in the doorway with a grin that could power a small city. "Saving the world again?" Brian smirked. "Just debugging life." She stepped closer, her eyes dancing. "You look lighter." "Because I'm not pretending to be a CEO anymore," he said dryly. "Turns out, I'm allergic to jargon." Sophie laughed, sliding into the chair beside him. "So what now? Back to your basement lair?" Brian tilted his head, pretending to consider. "Maybe, but I was thinking, dinner first." Her brows lifted, teasing. "Dinner? 2 nights in a row? Careful, Keller. People will talk." Brian leaned in, his voice low and warm. "Let them." Sophie's smile softened, her fingers brushing his in a quiet, deliberate gesture. "You're getting good at this." "At what?" he asked, feigning innocence. "Living a little," she said, eyes bright. Brian chuckled, shaking his head. "Beta test passed. Full release," she teased. He grinned. Version 2.0. Later, as they walked out together, past the glass walls, past the hum of voices, Brian realized something simple and startling. For the first time in years, his life wasn't just about systems and safeguards. It was about color, about laughter, about someone who made the chaos feel like a feature, not a bug. And as Sophie slipped her hand into his, Brian Keller, silent partner, reluctant CEO, master of firewalls, knew one thing for certain. This was the best patch update he'd ever installed. Chapter 13. Epilogue Debugged. The private lounge at the top of the building was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of city lights. Brian stood by the window, a glass of brandy in hand, watching the skyline hum like a living circuit board. Behind him, laughter drifted from the table where Alan was pouring another round. "Still can't believe you did it," Alan said, settling into the chair opposite Brian. His voice carried that familiar mix of awe and gratitude. "You could have kept everything." Brian shook his head, smiling faintly. "It was never mine to keep." Alan studied him for a long moment, then raised his glass. "To loyalty." Brian clinked his glass against Alan's, the sound sharp and satisfying. They drank, and for a moment, the weight of the past months, the chaos, the headlines, the sleepless nights, felt like nothing more than a bad patch finally fixed. The door opened, and Sophie stepped in, her curls catching the warm light, her smile quick and bright. "Hope you saved some for me," she said, sliding into the seat beside Brian with effortless grace. Alan grinned. "Ah, the famous UX whisperer." Sophie laughed. "I prefer design goddess, but I'll take it." Brian smirked, handing her a glass. "Careful. He'll start calling you that in board meetings." "Please do," Sophie said, eyes dancing. "Might improve the company culture." Alan chuckled, shaking his head. "You too. Remind me why I love this business." Brian glanced at Sophie, her fingers brushing his under the table in a quiet, deliberate gesture. His chest warmed, not with brandy, but with something far rarer, peace. Alan raised his glass again, his voice steady. To partnerships, old and new. Brian met Sophie's gaze, lips curving. To updates, he said softly. She grinned, leaning closer. Full release. Brian chuckled, his voice low. Version 2.0. Alan looked between them, bemused. I have no idea what that means. Sophie winked. Trust me, it's good. Later, as the laughter faded and the city stretched out like a glowing motherboard, Brian realized something simple and startling. Life wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean code or flawless logic. It was messy, unpredictable, full of bugs you couldn't anticipate. And for the first time, he didn't mind, because some errors lead to the best features.